Good evening, this is Viewpoint. I'm Zakka Jacob. Over the last 3 days, the Prime Ministers of Japan and Australia have had separate standalone meetings with Prime Minister Modi. 2 out of the 4 members of Quad have met with the Indian Prime Minister and have decided to take the relationship forward on a week when China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi will be here in the first high-level engagement by a Chinese official in more than 2 years. It's clear that India may not be on the same page as other members of Quad when it comes to Russia, when it comes to engaging with Russia. This fine balancing act, how long can India continue to walk this tightrope? We'll get to that in just 1 second, but first, the day's story so far in day 26 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's day 26 of Russia's onslaught of Ukraine, and the images that we are seeing are no less haunting. In fact, the most striking image coming from the port city of Mariupol. Remember, Russia has been pounding this city for the better part of the last couple of weeks. It's been bearing the brunt of Russia's attack. There's heavy artillery continuing to pound the city, even as the city's 400,000-odd residents remain trapped inside. There's very little food or water or even running electricity. Ukraine has rejected calls for the city of Mariupol to surrender. Remember, Mariupol is absolutely critical for the Russian president and his troops because they need to connect from the Sea of Azov to the Black Sea. Also getting visuals from the capital, Kiev. Remember, British intelligence reports are now suggesting that Russian troops are stalled outside Kiev for a number of days now. Today, Russian shells hitting several houses as well as a shopping complex in Kiev. And finally, we round off with images coming from Kharkiv. That's the third biggest city in Ukraine, where several civilians were caught in the midst of this live bomb that just exploded bang in the middle of a group of civilians, presumably killing quite a few. Let me now go across to Salma Abdulaziz. She's CNN correspondent joining us live from Lviv in the western part of Ukraine. For 26 days now, we've had Russian troops incessantly pounding some of the biggest cities in Ukraine. Let's talk about Mariupol for a second. The city and its mayor saying they're going to refuse to surrender. Zelensky has also said that there's no question of Mariupol surrendering. Why is capturing this port city so important for Vladimir Putin and his troops?
That's a very good question. If you look at the map of Ukraine, it's pretty clear to see what President Putin is trying to achieve here. What he's trying to do is create a land corridor that connects Russia directly to Crimea, of course, the area that was annexed in 2014, illegally annexed in 2014 by Russia, by President Putin. And he wants to make sure he has direct access to that warm water port. It is a strategic port for Russia. It would be its only warm water port that's warm throughout the year. And Mariupol, of course, being a strategic port city as well, along that intended land corridor for President Putin is absolutely critical. So this is a geographic war in the sense that this is a very strategic and important area that President Putin wants to take, wants to occupy. Now, the question is, how does he do that? Russian troops have been unable to advance on the city, take the city completely, and in the absence of that, they've encircled it, they've besieged it, they've cut off food, water, electricity, basic supplies for weeks now. Ukrainian officials were telling us today that bombs go off every 10 minutes in that city. The Ukrainian government says that civilians, innocent families, are now the target of Russian troops, that this is part of their strategy to essentially bomb the city into submission.
Also over the weekend, Salma, we got reports that Moscow is confirming that it fired 2 hypersonic missiles, 2 in 2 days. What do we know about these weapons, and what do we know for why Vladimir Putin is doing this? Is he getting desperate, or is he going for scorched earth?
This is an important escalation here. If you ask Western intelligence officials, they'll tell you that, yes, this is an escalation, rather. And the reason why it's happening, again, according to U.S. sources, according to Ukrainian officials, is because Russia has been unable to take control of Ukrainian airspace. The Ukrainian Air Force is a fraction the size that of the Russian Air Force. Russian troops, of course, expected that they would be able to have full control of the airs. That has not happened. So what you're seeing now is Russia use more long-range missiles, more complicated technology to try to reach Ukrainian targets from the relative safety of Russian airspace. And these hypersonic missiles, they travel extremely fast. They're extremely difficult to detect, stop, or intercept. It gives Russia that ability to break through Ukrainian airspace in the absence of an outright control of that airspace. So yes, this for Ukrainian officials looks like a sign of desperation, but it just means that Russia is willing to escalate, to intensify its war on this country to obtain those goals.
It certainly is an escalation, whether it's desperation because major cities have not fallen yet after 3 weeks of this invasion, or whether this is Putin going for scorched earth. We'll see. I guess this is going to be a critical week, this coming week, in this war. Thanks very much, Salma Abdulaziz, for joining us live from the city of Lviv. So what exactly is this hypersonic missile, the Kinzhal, which Russia claims it has fired 2 in 2 days over the weekend? Let's just run you through what we know so far of this hypersonic missile. As Salma was saying a moment ago, there is no detection capability with the West as of right now for detecting the hypersonic missile because it travels at 10 times the speed of sound. 10 Mach is what it's called. It has been used for the first time in combat by any country in a war. What we do know is that the Russian Defense Ministry over the weekend confirmed that the first hit was at a weapons depot, an ammunitions depot in a city called Mykolaiv. They used this, they claim, because they wanted to, the depot itself was tens of meters of deep into the ground. Now, what this can do, the Kinzhal, the hypersonic missile, it can travel distances of 2,000 kilometers, travel at 5 times the speed of sound, 5 Mach, and most importantly, there is no conventional detection mechanism for it. Any sonic device goes above the speed of sound. Hypersonic missiles, which have been in development for the last many years, can reportedly go at 10 times the speed of sound. They pierce through the Earth's atmosphere, take a parabolic loop, a hypersonic loop, and then come back in, piercing back into the atmosphere. The speed, the altitude, and the make, it is impossible to detect. Conventional ballistic missiles can be detected by your missile defense systems, your S-300s, your S-400s. But hypersonics, because they go in a parabolic loop, it's much harder to detect. This one, too, we're given to understand, both these hits that happened over the weekend were undetected by Western air defense systems. So clearly, Vladimir Putin is escalating this war, and this week is going to be critical for him because it'll be a month since this invasion, and major Ukrainian cities from Kiev to Mariupol to Odessa have not fallen yet. Now, let's shift the focus back to the India question and how India has been trying to walk this very delicate tightrope between balancing its interests on the one hand, not upsetting Putin, but at the same time realizing that it needs to be seen on the side of the Western countries and the Western parties, including in groupings such as Quad. Now, despite all the mayhem that's been unfolding in Ukraine, India has seemingly taken what many are calling a neutral stand. It has abstained in the votes that happened in the United Nations Security Council and in the General Assembly. But at the same time, it has also said that the conflict needs to end now and that ceasefire is the only way forward. So how is India walking this tightrope?
It's a mature, balanced diplomacy and the foreign policy position of India on the Ukraine war that's winning the Indian government admirers across the world. The latest to join the ranks is India's Quad partner Australia, that has backed the country's stand on Ukraine, saying that all Quad nations have their own bilateral ties with Russia and their own perspectives. And this endorsement of India's stand comes despite Australia being a vocal critic of Russia's stand on the devastation that is happening in Ukraine. Australian High Commissioner to India Barry O'Farrell praised Prime Minister Modi and acknowledged the Indian government's attempts to end the conflict. Unlike its Quad partners, the US, Japan and Australia, India has not condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine and has been maintaining that the crisis should be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy. And India's foreign policy on Ukraine was lauded even across the border, with one of the fierce critics of the government, Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan, praising PM Modi for keeping a neutral policy on Ukraine and importing crude oil from Russia despite American sanctions.
मैं आज हिंदुस्तान को दाद देता हूं, इन्होंने हमेशा आजाद फॉरेन पॉलिसी रखी। आज हिंदुस्तान उनके साथ मिला हुआ उनका अलायंस है, क्वाड के अंदर अमेरिका का अलायंस की हुई है, रूस से तेल मंगवा रहा है, जबकि सैंक्शंस लगी हुई हैं।
At the heart of these decisions was the safe evacuation of 20,000 Indians who were stuck in Ukraine. By keeping a neutral stand and not earning the ire of either Ukraine or Russia, we were able to bring back a majority of our nationals safely under the evacuation mission Operation Ganga. And the concerns are multifold. The tensions along the LAC and the growing expansionist policy of China is a concern for a country like India. India needs strategic and powerful partners like Russia to keep the Chinese in check. The unholy nexus of China and Pakistan further adds to India's concerns. This is not to underestimate the importance of American cooperation in multiple sectors and the further deepening of ties post the Indo-US nuclear deal. It is on this slippery ground that India has been very smartly managing and hedging its bets, aiming to secure its national interests. India's foreign policy is undergoing a new test of choices and partners in the international system. And India's strategy in Ukraine is a perfect example of that. But with the Russian aggression continuously increasing, being a fence-sitter will be a tightrope walk for India. With Rishi Sinha, Anitya Kumar for CNN News 18.
All right, on the talking point this evening on Viewpoint, we're joined by Aina Tangent, political affairs commentator from Beijing. Dr. Tara Karta is former director with the National Security Council Secretariat. M.K. Badrkumar, former diplomat, is also joining us. He served in the embassy in Moscow. And Jonah Blank is a former policy advisor to President Joe Biden of the United States. Dr. Tara Karta, I'll start with you first. So far, India seems to have managed its interests. On the one hand, not upsetting Putin, buying oil from Russian companies at discounted prices, abstaining at the votes at the UNSC as well as the UNGA. But how long can this balancing act go on for?
I don't think there's going to be any time limit on that, because as you can see, I mean, even the Europeans continue to buy oil from Russia. Saudi Arabia, I think, has refused to take calls from the US. And there is a whole lot of countries who are walking a very fine line. I think that includes Turkey for another. Italy's got reservations on sanctions. You know, there are a lot. Europe is trying to get some kind of peace going. So it's not like the media says that it's a globally unified approach. It is not. So in which case, each country is following its own interests. So, you know, in sense of the very fact that we've talked to Japan, Japan has had very strong statements on Ukraine. You just had the summit recently. Yeah. But at the same time, what they are talking of is, yes, there is a serious problem in Europe, which should not be replicated in the Indo-Pacific. That is their concern. Mm-hmm. And that is also our concern. And I suspect that is also going to come out in the India-Australia joint statement. The main concern is what's going to happen in the Indo-Pacific on Ukraine. And it's not about Ukraine. It's all about what is our security interest in this part of the globe. So sure. I don't think there's any problem with our position.
M.K. Badrkumar, we've had just in the last 2 or 3 days, we've had the Japanese Prime Minister come for the first summit between Fumio Kishida and Prime Minister Modi. And now today, we've had the virtual summit between the Australian Prime Minister and Prime Minister Modi. And it's clear that in the 4 members of the Quad, 3 of them have taken a very different position when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. Yesterday, we had the Australian High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell suggesting that we understand that India is taking a different position. The question again is, how long can this be sustained? Because ultimately, the question is going to be, and as Tara Karta said, how do we ensure that something similar doesn't happen in the Indo-Pacific?
Frankly, I don't see a problem at all here. You know, this kind of a tone, you know, that we need to introduce into the discourse at all. I see the Indian position as naturally evolving, taking into consideration, don't look at this as a binary, Putin versus Biden. No, we are looking at it in terms of India's interests. That is the bottom line. And if you are willing to recognize that, then you can very well understand that there is no reason for any kind of angst in our mind. It's a natural situation. And it is for the other countries to appreciate our considerations. You know, we don't really, if 3 out of 4 members of the Quad are going one way, evidently they are looking after their interests. What has Japan got to do with Ukraine? What has Australia got to do with Ukraine? You know, they have imposed the same scale of sanctions on Russia that Biden has done. So you see, the point is, each country is looking after its interests. And because those three countries are looking after their interests, and they are 3 out of 4, I don't understand the logic that we also should go tag along. It's absurd.
I think the
into.
concern, especially from Japan's point of view, is, and certainly from Australia's point of view, is that they don't want something similar to happen in the Indo-Pacific. And it's very clear that Xi Jinping is very closely watching what's happening. May I, sir, in a moment?
No. You go back to their statements. This is what you understand. But you go back to their statements. Their statements are totally in terms of the Ukraine situation, not in terms of Asia Pacific. This is something you are adding on. This is not Kishida's position. This is not Morrison's position.
Why do you think they've taken such heavy-duty sanctions on Russia? I mean, like you said, what has Japan got to do with Ukraine, or what has Australia got to do with Ukraine? Why have they done that?
Now we are coming to the real issue. They are part of the Western Bloc. That's what we are seeing. They are part of the Western Bloc. So whatever that bloc is deciding, they'll go along with it. And now
Japan did not do that in 2014. Why are they doing it now?
They're doing it now because the Western world is wanting it that way. And India is not part of that bloc.
Okay.
So India has no problems with taking a decision, independent decision.
No.
And it's for them to understand.
Agreed. I'm just saying if countries like Japan and South Korea are spooked by what's happened between Russia and Ukraine and are taking some of the most biting sanctions or joining along with some of the most biting sanctions that the West has taken, there must be a good reason for it in a way that we haven't seen in 2014, the last time when Crimea was annexed.
Why isn't the ASEAN doing that? You mentioned 2 countries.
Yes.
Those 2 countries are allies of the US. There are security treaties.
True.
Why are only 2 countries doing it? And
I'm not sure I would characterize them as part of the quote-unquote Western Bloc, as you said. But nonetheless, Jonah Blank, let me get in Jonah Blank into the conversation. There is a view, not just here in India, but in other countries in Asia, that we don't need to follow lock, stock, and barrel what the US is doing or what the European Union is doing. It's more your fight than ours, and therefore you can't expect us to take the same position against Russia that the West has taken.
Well, thank you for having me on. This isn't a fight between the U.S. and Russia. President Biden has made very clear that U.S. troops are not going to be engaged in Ukraine. This is a fight of most of the world standing up against a brutal invasion by a more powerful country against a weaker one. 80% of the nations in the UN General Assembly voted to condemn this. Only 4 nations stood with Russia. Another 35, including India, simply refused to take a position. This is not the West against Russia, US against Russia, NATO against Russia. This is most of the world against Russia. And as a friend of India, I think India has more of a stake than most countries in standing up for the principle that a more powerful nation like China does not get to simply invade another country like India, which may well be the next thing we see.
Okay, so let me ask Aina Tangent that, because repeatedly we're hearing from Chinese officials, including yesterday from Le Yucheng, who's the vice foreign minister, that they view the Quad as some kind of Asian NATO, despite the fact that, you know, official after official, whether it's Secretary Blinken, whether it's the Foreign Minister Jaishankar here, have all said that they don't view a military component to Quad. And yet, where is this rhetoric then coming from? Or are you simply testing the waters after seeing what Putin's managed to get away with in Ukraine?
Well, I think Beijing has noted a few things. First off, your first 2 speakers acknowledged what I think is the most important point, and that is we are now officially in a multilateral world. The idea that you have to be on one side of the fence or another side of the fence with a great power is no longer true. Second, in terms of how this is seen in Beijing, they see 2 faults. And the first one being that in 2007, Putin made it very clear he was very, very unhappy with the U.S.-led order, international order supported by the EU. He felt that Russia had been lied to and humiliated because of the expansion of the EU and NATO. Over the intervening 15 years, Russia has continually said, you know, enough is enough. Every time a new nation has come through, there has been problems. So from China's point of view, and I believe many Indian intellectuals I've talked to, they see this is a fuse lit 15 years ago, and people are acting surprised that it exploded. On the other hand, Russia, from China's point of view, has no right to go into another nation. The internal affairs of that nation are solely their business, not anybody else's. This is something that China has adhered to. If it started any wars or gone into any other nations and tried to change their regimes by force or otherwise.
And yet, Mr. Tangent, Beijing not only abstained at the votes that happened at the UN Security Council, but we're also seeing increasingly the statements from the foreign ministry in Beijing only supportive of Putin and his so-called security concerns.
That's not true. The latest statement from Beijing was through the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. when he made the position of China, I think, fairly clear. They see this as security issues. The only thing, and they agree with India, the only way to solve this is through negotiation. You'll note that during Ambassador Chin's speech, he refrained from criticizing either the United States or Russia. Simply because doing that would be counterproductive. If you want two people to come to the table, don't start calling them names. And I think this is the adult factor in the room. I think India recognizes that as well. India has a long historical bond with Russia. Russia came to India's aid when it was necessary. You have armaments from them. It's a situation where your national interests and also your historical interests coincide. With not rushing to judgment on this issue.
Dr. Karta, the big underlying concern, of course, is such a flare-up doesn't happen in the Indo-Pacific, and that's perhaps one of the reasons, perhaps even for the existence of the Quad. But what happens if such a thing happens? What if tomorrow China tests the waters, looking at what Putin has done and managed to get away with in Ukraine? How relevant is Quad then? And then if the Americans turn around and say, well, you didn't take our side in the whole Ukraine situation, so why should we take your side now? Dr. Tarakarta.
No, I don't think that's going to happen. China, see, please remember, we're a nuclear weapons country. Ukraine is not. You do not fight a conventional war on this scale with a country which is quite able to use its nuclear weapons. I think, as Modi once said, they are not Diwali crackers. Second thing is, this is not, within Quad, there is a great deal of cooperation going on as of now. I mean, just recently, there is an Australia, Japan, India, there is a securing supply chains initiative which is going on. There is SECA, Center for Emerging Technologies, which is being opened in Bangalore by the Australians. The Japanese are bringing in 5-7 trillion yen. This is all, it's part of what Quad is actually about, which is coming together in terms of production, in terms of...
No, but if there were to be, sorry, I'm interrupting, if there were to be a flare-up in the high seas in the Indo-Pacific, what happens then?
It's in their interest. Like we said, it's always a question of what is the interest of each country. So for the US, it's not in their interest that China should attack us. While having said that, you also need to remember that in small conflicts on the border, your defense is your problem. You can't rely on anyone else. If someone helps you with intelligence, maybe with supply chains, that's fantastic. But in the end, you have to rely on yourself, which is also why we have to rely on Russia. You need that stuff. We are still dependent on getting spares and everything from them.
All right, you have to fight your own fight, as we have seen over the last couple of years at the line of actual control. We'll leave it at that. Dr. Karta, Aina Tangent, M.K. Badrukumar, and Jonah Blank, thanks for joining us. We'll have more on this at 9 p.m. on Brass Tacks. In the meanwhile, Shivani will be joining you on the other side.